So this is the 12th, if you can believe it, Hollin Hills work group meeting. It's March 29th at 6:42. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. I know it's spring break, so I don't know how many people had plans, but I didn't. And so I guess we're all here together commiserating. Thank you all for coming tonight. I have a very broad agenda for tonight, specifically because I really want tonight to be a discussion about any kind of leftover comments or issues that were still kind of out there since the community meeting, and then any other follow-up questions we might have. And I was talking to Millie a little bit about this if you were on at the beginning of the meeting about what next steps would be after tonight's meeting, and then hopefully adjourning by 8:30 tonight. So with that, let's see. So from the community meeting, just kind of an overview, we got about over 100 questions and comments before, during, and after the community meeting. So we went through all the chat functions and question and answers, and then any emails that came in after the meeting, and we left the comment response period open until I think it was February 28th. So we left it open about a month for commenting on the boundaries, the contributing and non-contributing properties, as well as the draft language for the zoning ordinance amendment, the comprehensive plan amendment, and the rezoning that is moving forward. So duplicate questions were omitted. We had a lot that were asking about definition for contributing and non-contributing property, so we only included those once. We're still working with our county attorney on answering some of the legal questions that came forward. I will distribute those as soon as they are available. And then the county staff that reviewed it included myself, Kira Davis, Nicole Brannon, the Heritage Resources staff, and then Lily Yegazoo commented on it from the Zoning Administration Division. We also worked with Nick Reinhardt at the Supervisor's Office, and I apologize, traceries to Sarah and Laura and Catherine. I did not include them, but we worked with them on the design guidelines comment responses. So really did have a team effort on this comment responses. So with that, I don't want to go through every question, but so really throwing it out to you, what would you like clarified? But with that, I do have the kind of topics that were on the left-hand side of that document that was published. So if there's anything specific we want to pull out, or I was going to kind of go through them one by one and see if there was anything still outstanding or you needed follow up on. With that, we're going to have a separate conversation tonight about the non-contributing and contributing status that were still outstanding. And that's going to be in a separate PowerPoint tonight. So we're going to go through these first and then go to that discussion afterwards. But with that, were there any comments before we get started on those questions?
Laura, are you going to publish these? I mean, what happens to these answers that you've developed now?
I'm going to publish them on the website.
It's going to be on the website, okay.
But I wanted to discuss all with you in case some answers changed from tonight, because I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page before it went out to the general public. But that being said, if you shared it, it's not an issue. It's just a matter of wanted you all to get a chance to crack at it first to review and comment before we distribute it to the general public.
Laura, this is Millie. You mentioned
Yes.
briefly that you were going to distribute the responses you got from the legal team as soon as they became available to you. When do you anticipate that will be? And will it be available to the public after you give them to us on the website?
I don't know. I hope I'm anticipating them in the next week or so. But there were some additional questions I needed to run up the chain and clarify before we publish them. I will let you know as soon as I have an answer.
So you've got some responses in the last week or so, or you expect them in a week?
I'm expecting them in a week, by the end of this week.
But you're not sure if you'll get them all? I'm
not sure if I'll get them all. And there's also a discussion of what I can actually put out there as a response. That's part of the issue, is what we can actually, what the county attorney can publish. So yeah, that's what we're kind of going through, but I'm expecting that hopefully by the end of this week.
But now, okay, I understand that it's perhaps sensitive, but for those people that ask legal questions, don't they deserve it, even if it's not public?
I have that question with the county attorney. I hear you. I understand.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So were there any questions from the work group about, I'm pulling up the sheet. So if you have, can tell me what number you're specifically looking at for questions, I'm happy to go through them. If there are some you had some additional comments, concerns, or needed clarification on, I'm happy to kind of go through those. But if not, we'll kind of tick through this process, kind of skipping over 3, and we'll come back to that at the end. But kind of this just general topics from the meeting. I just don't think it's a good use of our time to go through every single question. So if anybody wants to jump in, please feel free.
How does the county envision doing the survey? Is that a mailing to each homeowner?
Nick, do you want to respond to that, or do you want me to take a crack at it?
I can take a crack at it. Good evening. So Barbara, I think that is what we are envisioning, is a mailer to each homeowner for that next survey. Laura, feel free to add anything to that.
Yeah, we're looking, and it's going to be kind of like, and I'm envisioning the same thing, Nick, is that we do a mailer, but there also might be a virtual option depending on how we set up the survey moving forward. At this point, we don't really have much info on the survey or what it's going to look like, but we do understand that we need to get it out to as many people as possible. So it'll probably be a multi-pronged effort of a virtual and a hard copy, understanding that, you know, checking and verifying we don't get multiple, you know, entries and that type of thing.
Are you going to ask, I'm wondering if we can help you with that by providing email addresses or something like that?
Yeah, I just think at this stage we haven't developed the survey yet, because we're not quite sure what it's going to look like. To be honest, that's our next thing to do after this meeting, right, Nick, is to develop the survey, when it's going to go out and what it's going to look like. I think at that point, if we know you guys are there and we know how to reach out, so I think we'll definitely do that. And it will definitely be at least 30 days. Like, it's not going to be a survey that's 2 weeks open shut. So there will definitely be ample opportunity to get the word out there and distributed to everybody that wants to comment and respond to it.
And so when you said it's being mailed out, but we'll be able to answer it on paper or online, is that right?
I think that's the goal, Jerry. I think that the goal would be, ideally, to be honest, it'd probably be easier for us to do it digitally, but we understand that that's not the easiest method for everyone to use. So it'll probably be, and I'm not sure if it's going to be like the community meeting mailer you got, where it's like, we're having a community meeting, please, you know, come on this day, here's how to contact us, and here's the link to the survey, or if it's going to be an actual survey being mailed out. But we will determine that moving forward.
Okay.
Survey, would they be required to mail something back in?
That's a good question, and we'll address that. I'm sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah.
If you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say, I just initially thinking if they choose to fill it out by mail, then it would be mailed back in, but that may not be the most efficient thing. But like Laura said, we'll iron out those details after tonight. That's going to be priority number 1, most likely, or 1B to work on for us.
Well, if you're counting on the USPS, your responses come in by Christmas.
Well, yeah, we'll get them by next Christmas. We'll just send them with my Christmas cards from last year. Oh, okay. Yeah. Were there any other questions about, I mean, we can go through some of them if you'd like to. I have kind of talking points if you really wanted to, but I know the work group, we've been talking to you about all of these since almost the beginning. So this is really the opportunity we have our design guidelines. Each traceries is here if you have any more questions about design guidelines. I do want to have a couple of them. If there's no questions on the ARB process or building permits, we talked about the petition, community support, kind of looking forward. Were there any other questions on the petition or community support? Because I know that's kind of unclear at this point, but we have committed to doing a survey and we'll let you all know as soon as we have more information on how it looks like and how it's going to be distributed. But any questions on that or design guidelines, clarification for that? And I'm sorry, was someone have a comment? Okay. And then the next thing, item number 6 on the screen there is the design review committee versus the ARB process. And we know that needs clarity. So I think we're proposing at this point, and I know Barbara, you were kind of toying around working with that. I hadn't really checked in with you on it lately, but kind of what that would look like, and giving a kind of step-by-step process of, you know, if your proposal had to go to the DRC and the ARB, how would that work, when it would be submitted, and we can work with you directly on that and maybe publish that as well as for more information for.
You know, just to give you a little background, Laura.
Sure.
Generally, people who come to the DRC before they go to the county. So that would be, that's the usual thing. We say to people, you need to give us what you intend to give to the county. So they come to us first. They don't go to the county and then come to us. First, they come to us. So it's a different process. We're earlier in the process, and we try to be extremely proactive at this point, to respond quickly, to deal with things that we can deal with as an administrative matter and so forth. You know, sometimes people come to us when they're just beginning to get the germ of an idea, and they want to know, you know, how is this going to look, or how is this going to fly, or they have an architect who has never worked in Hollin Hills before, and that architect brings us something that they've drawn up that they think meets the Hollin Hills design guidelines. And sometimes we say to them, gee, it looks great, go to it. And other times we say, no, you don't get it. So but we're earlier in the process than you are. And our goal is not to slow the process down at all. So I'll give you that right now.
So it's fair to say that they need to basically go through the design review committee, notice you all, go through your review process before they even come to submit for a building permit. Is that accurate?
Right. And I don't think that really then changes anything, because they've always come to us before they went to the county.
So then the question comes up, and I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Okay, so the DRC has no problem with it, but then they go to the architecture review board, and the architecture review board says, we would like you to change the materials on the front or something like that. Then they would have to go back through you all, I'm assuming, to just make sure those changes are okay with you.
You know, that's where the rubber sort of hits the road right now, where we internally need to have some discussion about what our response would be to something like that. And I think that would be in such a small minority of cases, but yet the possibility exists. So we do have to have a way to respond. So that's exactly where our issue is right now. We're going to think about that and how we should respond to that.
Okay, that's
Right.
great. Because sorry, go ahead. Someone else had.
Finish your thought.
I was going to say, I think it's helpful to have a letter from the design review committee before you go to the ARB, or if it's not a letter, an email or something that says they've reviewed it, so that there's some sort of acknowledgement that we can't require it before it comes to the ARB.
Sure.
That wouldn't be something we're allowed to do, but something that we could you could show as kind of a preliminary. It's kind of how we do with our sign plans. We make them go to the sign people and make sure they meet all the zoning ordinance provisions before they come to the architectural review board. So we're not kind of afoul of that before we even get started. Millie, did you have something? I think that was you, Millie.
I can't hear her.
Muted. Millie, you're muted, I think.
I thought I heard you just say that you cannot require an individual to go first to the DRC and have any kind of a letter or whatever, because you've hit home many times saying you don't interfere in private matters.
Right. Right.
Community.
That's
So
right.
what
We can't
not-
require anyone to go to the DRC. Right.
So if someone comes to you with a plan and lays it out, and you all will approve it if you approve it. You won't say, oh, you've got to go back to the DRC. Am I listening and hearing you correctly?
Yes. And that's what we're trying to get, is that if the DRC disagrees with the ARB approval, right? So if the ARB asked for a change that the DRC said was okay, so then it kind of goes to this, and I agree with you, is that the ARB is acting independently of it. However, one, I can see this playing out as if you come in to us and you haven't gone to the DRC, we would definitely say we highly recommend you going to the DRC before coming to the ARB. But that being aside, we can't force anyone to do that.
Why would you do that when you're being appointed at the request of this community, of the CAHH specifically, to be the of all things architectural in this regard?
So,
and you're the enforcement arm and the effective HOA for the community. So why would you want to question what the ARB judges if they're supposed to be the judge?
right.
First of all, can I just respond to that? Millie, not everything that is required to be reviewed by the ARB is.
That was a question for Laura, unless you've now switched jobs.
Millie,
right,
please, I'm just trying to give you the DRC perspective here.
Can you answer
So-
the question, please?
let's take it as a different example. So we've talked about, and thank you, Elise, for putting in Lake Anne in the chat, because that reminded me of Lake Anne. So we have a historic overlay district in Lake Anne and Reston. And Reston Association is a frequent reviewer of applications within Reston. So if an application came into Lake Anne, we would ask the applicant if they've talked to Reston Association, just as a courtesy to try and help someone get through the process. That doesn't mean that we take into account. I mean, it's helpful if everybody's in support, because that makes everything easier. But if the ARB feels strongly they don't like the materials or the color, or not the color, but materials or facade or addition or whatnot, then they would be acting independently. So it kind of goes to this from what Barbara's described. It's this public or this private, public, private again. So the private would be showing up to the DRC before you even apply for your building permit and saying, hey, we want to put on an addition, what do we need to do? And then once you would get that approval, or you would propose it to them, or if you don't get their approval, then you just come to the county and, ask for your building permit. Then that's the public piece. So at that point, you'd get your building permit reviewed and you come to the Architectural Review Board. The Architecture Review Board can act with or without the letter from the DRC, as you pointed out, Millie. It's just, we would recommend that you get it, because then once you get through us, or us meaning the ARB, there's still the DRC that would review it and comment on it. So the DRC is back to that private piece.
I think what you're hitting on is one of the big objections to the HOD, which is people do not want 2 layers of regulation or supposed regulation by any entity. It's either private or it's public. It shouldn't be both at burden to add to this community, and it should be separate. And, you know, the DRC can take up with any individual if they don't come to them and sue them like they've done before, or they can allow people to do what they've asked the county to provide, and that is to go to your ARB for decision.
That's right.
Thanks.
Yep. So yeah, I think though I want to have it a little bit clearer for the general public. And Barbara, maybe it's just something as simple as saying the DRC recommends you go to the, the DRC recommends you go to them before you apply for your building permit, trying to do a step-by-step of, step one, DRC, note the ARB can't take this into account when making their decision. But just showing they're two completely independent processes but going on concurrently at the same time. So were there any other questions on the DRC or the ARB? Okay. All right. So the historic overlay district zoning ordinance process. So there are some questions that came up about feasibility, additional workload of permit reviews, and then other Virginia examples of historic subdivisions. So I do kind of have some updates on that. So for the feasibility part, staff is not charged with the zoning ordinance of looking at the feasibility, and economic value for or against a historic overlay district. Staff is charged with looking at providing a recommendation on the boundary and the historic significance of the area in question. We don't necessarily, I mean, that's something that there's studies out there on, but we wouldn't include that in our staff report or analysis. Were there any comments about that or discussion? And then another question that came up was workload of permit reviews. So I did go back and do some more analysis and research on that. I think that what I've used before is that there were 9 building permits from between 2019 and 2020 that had come into the county that would have triggered an architectural review board review. And those included decks, additions that came in, other items that have exterior modifications. I don't think that number would change from year to year. There was a concern about the other historic overlay district that is coming in that's under review right now is Homes Run Acres, which I think is a little bit smaller. It's about 330 or 40 or so single family dwellings. But it would be an additional workload on the ARB. They are aware of that. And it really, we would have to see how it would go moving forward. There is an opportunity to add meetings more often than once a month if that's something that the ARB wanted to do. But they would have to have that discussion. I would say probably in the past 15 years, I think the most, when I was looking back at cases, well, in the past 3 years that I'd been working with the ARB, I think the most we had one night was 9. And that was mostly because it was one subdivision. One subdivision had come in with 5 houses. And then we had 4 other cases. So those were all reviewed at the same time. And none of the meetings have really gone past, I want to say maybe 11 o'clock at the latest. So, and then the additional workload of permit reviews, I commented in the spreadsheet as well, as we're in the process right now of hiring 2 additional heritage resource staff. And they won't be dedicated solely to the historic overlay district reviews, but they will help with our workload. So there is a commitment from the county that the heritage resources workload is increasing with these new historic overlay districts that are coming in. And then the last point is there's additional example would be the Lorton Reformatory and Prison. That is a very, very large area. And they already have residential reviews that go in that area currently. I think there's 100 and like, I don't remember the exact numbers. I'm sorry, 140. So single family dwellings with a 55 and plus community that are under review by the ARB. And then there's apartment complex and some retail properties. So there's a large number of reviews, probably have one a month from Lorton with the number of development and activity going on in that area. And that's not solely residential. Were there any questions on that?
How does that number compare to Fairfax County permitting process in general? On the first, number one, you said the last 5 years there have been 192 cases approved by the ARB, and additionally, 142 were brought to the workshop. Are the 142 part of the 192 or in addition?
Yeah, so the 192, and Kira, correct me if I'm wrong, but the 192 were the ones that came to the, those were the action approved items. I think there was only one denial in 15 years, but those were the ones that were approved. And then some cases, if they're need extra help, have come to the ARB multiple times. And that's because of different issues. The homeowner can represent themselves or some sort of design conflict or issue or historic nature of the house is impacted. But those workshops all ended up probably as an action item, if that makes sense. So those are incorporated.
And how does that compare to how many permits are permitted in Fairfax County by the county outside of the ARB? Is the county?
I can find that number for you, but we are a very, very small fraction of that. Yeah.
Okay, I was just curious. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I apologize. I think when I did the research for the 1 year between 2019 and 2020 in Hollin Hills, I want to say there were probably 500 permits. And those are, it could be anything from mechanical, electrical, footing, foundation permits. So there's a whole slew of different permits that the ARB doesn't have purview over that would come to the county. Okay. And then another example of a historic subdivision, and I don't know if anyone had an opportunity to go visit this site, but just wanted to give you a little overview on it, was I reached out to our colleagues in Arlington, and they were talking about the Maywood Historic District in Arlington, Virginia. And that one was significant because of the time that it was platted in the early 1900s, but it was really developed over almost the entire 20th century. So it doesn't have a specific time period that goes to like a 30-year period like Hollin Hills does. It's really platted by the entire evolution of that subdivision over time. So there's multiple periods of architecture. And so it's not really a one-to-one for Hollin Hills, but it is a residential neighborhood. It was established by Arlington in the 1990s and then put on the National Register of Historic Places after that. So I asked her about different examples from homeowners, and her comment was it was continual education of people that move into the neighborhood, and then the changing of homeowners was the biggest issue that she kind of faced with their local historic board review. But I definitely recommend, if you're interested in kind of looking at that, please go ahead and look at, it's called Maywood Historic District in Arlington.
Laura, I just
yes.
I did look at it, and
okay.
And I read a lot about it, that things that happened during the time. It was highly controversial. It was split almost half and half in the neighborhood, and it barely passed the BOS in Arlington by a 3-2 vote. And as I understand it, anecdotally from people I know, and also from things I read, that recently one homeowner was forced to pay over $30,000 to replace the roof with a pressed tin instead of $5,000 for asphalt, because the ARB determined that they couldn't use asphalt, and then they appealed it to the BOS. The BOS said, we're really sympathetic, but we have to, and here's my question. We have to uphold the guidelines set forth by the ARB. You've told us all guidelines are guidelines, which means they're helpful, they're instructive, but they're not enforceable. Is that different in Arlington County?
I don't know. The guidelines, and it sounds like it would be a very, and I can't speak to that press tin case, but if they analyze the history of the house and had said, you know, press tin was a contributing feature of the house and we feel like it needs to be replaced, I can't say from my experience with the ARB that they've placed that hardship on someone, because of the fact we have 5 architects on our ARB. They're very aware of cost of materials and different pieces of design and other opportunities out there, and alternative options. But and that's the option, though, that the appeal process is there if they feel like the ARB does not is not meeting, you know, their purview. But I don't, like I said, I don't know what it is in Arlington specifically, but the design guidelines are guidelines to that effect. I mean, it could have been, like I said, could have been the argument was made for the significance of the pressed tin roof. But I'm just speculating. I don't know the details on that case.
I don't know, but I know that one of the stated purposes of the Civic Association here was that they didn't want to see neighbor pitted against neighbor like they were in the lawsuit. But I understand from people I know that members of the association in Maywood are known to lurk through backyards, taking pictures of things that they think might be in violation, report them to their ARB, which is called something different, but and then the individuals are forced to tear out their new window or whatever. Doesn't sound like it's working as far as not pitting neighbor against neighbor, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah. So if there was a violation in that sort of sense, it would go to our Department of Code Compliance. And then the permit process, they would check to make sure that the person got a permit if it was needed for those things. So the ARB really only has a jurisdiction over what's permitted. We were talking, I mean, we always talk about fencing, but fencing doesn't have a permit to go in unless it's in specific places or over a certain height, as is in the zoning ordinance now. So you could say the neighbor's fence is not in conformance, but that's something that I mean, to be honest, it's something we're going to talk about in a minute, fences, once we get to that piece, but we can talk about it now. And Lily, feel free to jump in, but the zoning ordinance amendment as it stands now, there's a provision in there that says the fencing must come to the Architectural Review Board for review. This is kind of and it's and I really want to get honed in on this tonight for a response because of the fact that fences, like I just said, fences don't require building permits. So this would be incumbent on neighborhood oversight of those different things. So the options we have for the fencing could be, we could include it in the zoning ordinance, and it would be caught kind of, it's enforceable, but not, it wouldn't be triggered the same way as an addition or a deck. It's kind of a provision that's in the zoning ordinance that would be kind of, I call them a secondary offense, but it would be coming in on a piece. So that's something I wanted to talk about too tonight was fences. So I don't know if anybody feels strongly about having the fences in the zoning ordinance as a regulation, just because it's hard to enforce from a county perspective. Lily, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
So yeah, everything Laura said is correct. And currently, as you may be aware, fences are, you know, the height and the locational fences are included in the zoning ordinance. And even though most fences, except very few that are, you know, surrounding a swimming pool, do not require a permit. So they're not automatically reviewed by the ARB. And if additional limitations are added in the zoning ordinance to, let's say, prohibit fences in this specific area within the HOD, or if additional review is required by ARB, regardless of whether a building permit is required or not, that could potentially be also problematic in terms of being only applicable to this specific HOD, when fences would not be automatically have a limitation in other R2 zoning districts. So that's why we wanted to have this discussion today and get a sense as to whether, as currently included in the zoning ordinance, fences would be limited to the maximum allowable height, and the additional review would be included in the design guidelines as currently included in the draft design guidelines, indicating that when reviewed by the ARB, they need to be compatible with the intent of this neighborhood, and also with the existing structures, and continue that openness between adjacent properties. That is one option that we can consider, or like Laura mentioned, additional limitation like requiring fences to be reviewed by the ARB to be included. But that is, again, the issue here is that because fences do not typically require building permit, how is that triggered, and how would we make sure that we get reviewed by the ARB?
The greatest opposition to fences in Hollin Hills has been to what are commonly referred to as perimeter fences. Fences which encircle a yard on the boundary line and either close in a backyard, or we've never had anybody try and close in a front yard, thank God. But that has been something that we have worked very hard at limiting, is perimeter fences. A number of people in the neighborhood have put in fences because they have dogs and they want some space where the dog can run and be, kept in a certain area. But we've managed to keep those from being perimeter fences. I don't want to speak to the neighborhood, for the neighborhood on this matter. And I'm not sure that I understand exactly what is the present requirement in the zoning regulation, or what do you envision that the zoning regulation will say with respect to height and location of fences? I don't understand what the proposal is.
So the current zoning ordinance requirement is that any fence within the front yard cannot be more than 4 feet in height. And the front yard is defined as the area between the front property line and the front of the existing structure. The setback for the R2, the front yard setback for the R2 may be 30 feet, and I don't know it offhand, but let's say if it's 30 feet, but the building is set back 50 feet from the front property line, that whole area, that 50-foot distance between the front property line and the front of the house is considered the front yard. So any fence within that front yard area is limited to 4 feet. But when you go to the side and the rear, the height limitation is applicable to the side, the minimum side yard, which is the side setback, and typically it's 10 feet. Don't quote me on the setbacks, because I mixed the R3 and R2s. But let's say, for example, if it's 10 or 12 feet, within that 12 feet area, the height limit will apply, and that's up to 6 feet in the or 7 within the side and the rear yard, and the rear is typically 25 feet. So it applies with it just within that minimum required yard area. The proposal at this point is to have the fence limitation be included for the most part, to keep them as they are in the current zoning ordinance, but have the additional review by the ARB to make sure that what is being proposed is consistent with what is recommended in the design guidelines.
We have a lot of front yard privacy fences that I am sure and I'm sure you saw them as you were driving around the neighborhood. Or privacy screens. I mean, how do you define a fence? Must there be a right angle on it in order to make it a fence? What if it's a privacy screen? We have a number of those. Are they included in your zoning proposal?
So we will be looking at those closely. I know they're not, there are a few, and some of them may be an extension of the existing structure itself, or it could be a freestanding structure. So in the past, when we have something that does not clearly meet the definition of what is considered a fence, we would look at it and make a determination case by case. But we'll definitely look at those closely and make that determination whether they are considered fences, and then does the 4-foot high limitation apply to those, or are they
That's an answer that we need.
structure?
I think that's an answer we need to know.
That'll be part of the analysis. Yes.
How do you, we need to know that up front. How do you define, is a privacy screen, and there are a number of them in Hollin Hills, and I invite you to drive around and look at them. Are they fences or are they privacy screens?
So currently we don't have a definition of a privacy screen. We just have fence in the zoning ordinance. That's why we have to take a look at those and make the determination whether they will be considered a fence, or will they be considered an extension of the existing structure itself. And we would need to look at how they are attached to the structure, and
A lot of
whether
times they're not
freestanding
attached to
or
the
not.
structure.
If they're freestanding, they may be considered a fence. So that's why we have to look at them.
And
closely
Barbara,
and make
We
that
have to look at
analysis.
them. Do you mean, I'm
So-
not trying to be difficult here. Or do you mean that you have to take a look at them at the time that the person wants to put up a privacy screen? Or you're going to take a look at it now as you draft this zoning rule?
We will look at them now as we draft the zoning ordinance text, the draft text. But Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, but anything that we include in the zoning ordinance would only be applicable to future additions or construction. It wouldn't apply to anything that exists now, for the most part.
that's what I was going to bring up. So I brought up this screen. I don't know if you all can see this, just Google Images, a Google map, but just to help, I know Lily was talking about front yard, rear yard, that type of thing. I know it's helpful sometimes to have an image. So I'm going to draw on this, so bear with me here. So I'm just going to take this 219 Paul Spring Road. So the front yard would be anything in front of this red line here, from this line to the property line. That would be considered a front yard. So if you had a fence, once again, this is just one property, so take it with that in knowledge. If you had a fence up here, or wanted to do, as Barbara was saying, a perimeter fence, the fence could not, under the current zoning ordinance, could not be higher than 4 feet in height. This is just not with the HOD at all. This is just existing today without the HOD. So that fence would be able to that fence would be allowable by the zoning ordinance now. So the goal of the zoning ordinance amendment would be, do we want to put a regulation on fencing to say we don't want these fences to go in because it will affect the significance of the historic district? And I think the answer is yes. However, we didn't want to put a specific height or location in that regulation, because if we say you can only have there's too many variables in that instance, and that's why we would defer that decision to be determined by the Architectural Review Board on a case-by-case basis, instead of saying no fences in a front. And we talked about different options. We talked about no fencing in a front yard. We talked about, do we want 4-foot fencing in a front yard? We want to have no fencing at all and limit all fencing. But there are certain situations where it may be called for, specifically, Barbara, because you brought up the point that there are privacy fences existing today, and privacy screens, fences. But in our determination, what Lily was saying in the analysis is if something came in and somebody wanted to have an analysis of that privacy screen and whether it would be determined a fence by our definition, that would go to Lily's office at the Zoning Administration Division for that determination. And that's when that analysis would happen. So we're really not arguing what the definition of a fence is, as much as there's that gray area of fencing, but really it's where you want it and how tall it wants to be and how it's going to be regulated. If you put it in the zoning ordinance, it makes it much harder to allow for some flexibility. So if there is ever an instance that you need a fence, then you'd have to go through, you would have to ask for a modification of the zoning ordinance through special permit or something to allow to have that change. Whereas if we defer it and say, for example, if this is one of those things that we leave out of the zoning ordinance and let the design review committee have purview over, then your group would be able to say this fence needs XYZ. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have design guidelines recommendations for fencing, because there are design guidelines that have recommendations for things that don't have permits, but it would leave the interpretation of if the fence is appropriate to the district up to the DRC instead of the Architectural Review Board. And Barbara, I know we've talked before about we don't want to have this gotcha moment, or we want it to be clear up front what's regulated. And sometimes this it's not hidden, but it's just this principle in the zoning ordinance that's kind of hard for us to enforce and hard for us to upkeep, because it's not triggered by a building permit or rezoning case. So that's kind of what I think we're looking at tonight.
Laura?
Yes.
Your explanation is helpful, as was Lily's, but here's my question. All throughout our working group meetings, you made it very clear that an HOD and the ARB would address the structure and any kind of structural additions, and it would not include fences, landscaping, driveways. And recently, since we've seen these guidelines and they've evolved, everything's thrown in like the kitchen sink, and it's all very subjective, and it's a slippery slope. See it slipping. And I don't understand why the ARB would have a say-so in fences, other than what the county requires in a permit. Especially if they're so vague and subjective.
I think we talked about fencing, but I know that landscaping and driveways we've always included as part of our purview over the Architectural Review Board has, because they've always had purview over site plans and development. So even if, a new addition or a new site plan or a pool was going in that rose to a certain level that triggered a site plan, the ARB would have purview over that as well.
If only if an addition goes before the ARB and it may be requiring, then they look at how you're going to landscape around the addition, but they just don't look for.
Correct.
Okay.
This came up at a meeting with Homes Run Acres last night about if a certain tree could be removed and whether or not that would need ARB approval. And the answer is no. If you were taking the tree down to put up an addition, that's a whole different story, because then you're affecting the screening and the landscaping by putting it in, but that revolves back to what the ARB's purview is over building permits and site plans. So if we go back to the fencing a little bit, the fencing is a little bit of an anomaly because there's not a building permit required. I'm getting a fence put in my backyard tomorrow, but there's no building permit required for a 6-foot fence to go. It actually felt, what?
Is it a perimeter fence?
Yeah, it is. Well, I have a townhouse, so it's like, you know, it's my whole backyard. But to that point is there's no building permit required from the county. I did have to get my HOA to approve it, but that's beside the point. But to that point is that if the community feels strongly enough that they want the extra ARB purview in there, we can do that. But like I said, it comes back to this principle of it's hard to enforce. And if someone's coming in just for their fence, do we want to subject them to the ARB review for just a fence? That's where my thought is moving forward. And not saying we have to do it like this, but the other established historic overlay districts with viewshed impacts do not have this either. But this is a different ballgame, but just a new precedent for this HOD.
There are a lot of new precedents.
Oh yeah, everything. Every time we turn around.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So are there not some things that basically get approved by staff?
So they
So
could
don't go to the ARB?
They could get approved by staff, but we haven't proposed that at this point. So that's an option if we feel like, so when they approve it from staff's perspective, I call it like ARB light. Like, for example, it's a building permit, but for an interior modification, or from you can't see it from the public right of way, or this one doesn't really apply in this district, but you can't see it from any contributing or non-contributing. You can't see it from any contributing structures. So if we do an analysis and we can see that, that's something we could add in as a provision. And Lily and I had talked about that before, whether or not that's something we want to add as an ARB administrative approval. But it depends on where, it really depends on where the community wants to see it, right? Because once again, if there's no building permit for it, the only way we're going to hear about it is from the community telling us we need a building permit approval, or I'm sorry, we need a ARB staff approval on this fence. And we won't, and that's where my rub is that we're not going to get notified of it. So then we have all this, I'm just very sensitive of that. We don't want to create an issue between staff and the neighborhood, the individual applicants, of getting this additional approval for a fence. But that is an option if we feel like we want to pursue that, and Lily and I can kind of draft language to that effect. I'm really trying to gauge whether or not we want to include it in the zoning ordinance or not. So that's where I'm.
So what happens if this was in the zoning ordinance, but of course it's not, you don't know about it because it's not triggered by a building permit, but the fence goes up overnight? Then what happens?
We'd probably get a phone call. It would go, I'm assuming, so it would go to the Department of Code Compliance and then, or directly to us, either one. So our Department of Code Compliance looks at all their zoning and code regulations. They would alert us the nature of the issue, and then they'd have to go to the Architectural Review Board for something we call an after the fact addition, but offense basically. So it just means that they got it in, and the ARB could tell them to take it out. So it's kind of if they don't approve it. So it's just a little hairy because the Fairfax County ARB doesn't have a lot of power over fences. So if we felt like if there were permits for fences specifically, that'd be a whole different ballgame. It wouldn't be having this discussion.
Right.
But because there isn't, like I said, trying to gauge the larger understanding of how high we want to elevate it, or do we just defer to the design review committee and just have that one review for the fence instead of having the whole ARB come to that analysis.
Thank you.
Yep.
Talking just then, you said something about the interior changes going to the ARB. Since when?
No, I did not say that. I said they were not. There's a list of 4 or 5 things in the zoning ordinance that say ARB staff can approve XYZ. And one of them, if it's an interior modification, but requires a building permit. So if it was a mechanical permit or something the ARB doesn't have purview over, but happened to be within a historic overlay district, they would ping it to us to see if we would need to
You
review
mean
it.
if someone was getting a new HVAC system, that would have to be approved by staff, at least administratively?
No. And that's when we would do our triage. That's when we would do our triage, because what happens is building permit looks at it, it gets in our computer mapping system, it says, oh, this isn't a historic overlay district, so they automatically send it to us. But that's when staff would say, does not apply, not applicable, or anyone. So that's what part of the staff administrative
Are
approval.
there any interior modifications that require a building permit that you would have to review and
Unless there's it has to be an exterior modification
that's
to the building. Yes, sorry. No, sometimes we have things like insulation come in that requires a building permit. And they're like, oh, it's in a historic overlay district, but we would just say, no, we don't have purview or comment on that.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me pull up my screen again.
Before you leave that,
Sure.
this is Bob Kinzer. I would like to go on record as supporting your zoning suggestion for fences. That's one of the most critically important things, I think, in the community outside of the actual buildings themselves that we could use some help for. In terms of.
So Mr. Kinzer, just want to clarify, you want to have the zoning as it stands now, the zoning ordinance amendment says ARB review, is it Lily, and correct me if I'm wrong, it says ARB review is required for the installation of any new fences or something along those lines.
Something like that, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we want the additional ARB assistance on that.
Yeah, it's anything we can get to keep people from fencing in their yards with obnoxious fencing.
And then for anyone on there, can you let me know how big of an issue this is? You know, is it something that happens all the time and that you keep having to say no, you know, like, is it, because I just don't have a sense of, I know we talked about it, but I don't really have a sense of how often it's happened. I see your hand, Jerry, but.
I'd say it was a very big issue. It's a huge issue. And it's not that it happens all the time, as far as I can tell, but it only takes a few fences that do that to make a huge, huge impact. So for me, I agree with Bob, and I think it's really important.
And
It seems to come in spurts. If you have people putting in a fence, then somebody else gets the idea to put in a fence, and then it's like whack-a-mole.
If I could follow up, is that in the front, the side, the rear, or it doesn't matter which yard?
Any place.
Fences, yeah.
We haven't had as much trouble. I have to say, the biggest issues have not come in the front yard, but we've had a lot of backyard issues where people want to put up big fences surrounding the perimeter of their backyard, and that has been a big issue in the community because we have just not want, it's an anathema to how the community was created, to have a free flow of land and of view from one home to the next and one property to the next. And if you have somebody putting up, you know, a 6-foot backyard fence that surrounds their property, that destroys it. So we haven't had any fence applications in the last year, but trust me.
We had some fences without application.
I mean, I have an example of a fence. We own a second property on Daphne, and you know, I was out there one day and there was this low fence covered in fake ivy. It's like, where did it come from? And not only that, there was also a what do you call it? when you need when the power goes, a generator. There's a generator that's only a few feet from the property line. Where did that come from? So these things just pop up, and yes, it's covered in fake ivy. You don't see it too much, but it's there. And then the fake ivy comes off and it looks like crap. So there's stuff like that going on, in addition to the ones that are really obvious.
It's been my experience, which goes over a lot of years, that there are two reasons for fences. One is animals, and sometimes, I guess, small children, but mostly animals. The second reason is we live in a glass house. And despite all Goodman's good intentions in terms of sighting, and he did a pretty good job. For example, here in this house, if you look out the bedroom windows, you look right into the other windows right across the property line. So there is no privacy unless you put up heavy drapes. So there is a good reason for fences, and I would register my objection to the ARB getting involved beyond what the Fairfax County already does and allows. I don't think there's a huge problem with fences. I don't see that many, but when there are fences, they're either privacy fences or they're for a good reason. So I think people should have the right to protect their privacy and their animals.
Yeah.
And
Privacy fences are one thing, but just big fences, like there's some recent examples of, are really obnoxious.
the reason for them is privacy.
Well, and so that's where the issue becomes, is that, we're talking about, so the provision as it's written right now allows for a very broad, flexible kind of interpretation, and just says it has to any fencing has to come to the ARB for review. So that would be something, and I think that's what I'm hearing is there's general support for that. But once again, if for any reason, do you think that might cause more heartache than good? That might be a sticking point of, getting through this, because I agree 100% that it does affect the character of the neighborhood, but going out there and surveying everything, there's existing examples out there that are not, and those won't be affected by the new. But if you're trying to put a new fence up for any reason, and that's another thing that we'll have to go through. But are there any other anybody else on the work group wanted to comment on that in support or opposition of that general principle for fencing? Go ahead.
I just had, can you clarify again what the backyard rules are on fences? They can be 6 feet high, is that correct? The current ones.
I'm going to defer to
Current
Lily. I
one,
think so.
Actually, yeah, they go up actually to 7 feet within the 25 foot.
And how far do they have to be from the property line?
They could be at the property line, anywhere within from the property line and going in 25 feet. That's considered the rear yard. They cannot be more than 7 feet in height in that area.
Well, I think I'm not sure. If somebody put in a 4-foot fence in front, I don't think that would be a real problem. I think in the backyard, I mean, especially if it's a totally blocked off fence, because we have a lot of bad examples of those things, and it does affect the neighbors' yards. I think putting up something like a small view blocker fence out of the bedrooms isn't bad, but I think when you have them go along the whole property, it does affect what the community was meant to be, which Barbara Ward pointed out. We're supposed to have visibility into different properties, and the flow of the land is very important here. So I don't know. I think there ought to be something said about it. I don't know how far to get into it. I think the idea of keeping fences pretty much transparent, making them be set back in the yards would be important for people, and keeping a restriction of a lot less than 6 feet. I just don't think that makes a whole lot of sense.
Thank you, Mary. I will say, when we talk about it going to the A or it would be going to the A or B, and they would be taking all of these things into account on a case by case basis. So how close the neighbor's property was, whether or not you're looking right into their bedroom, you can wave, that type of thing. But and style, design of the fence, all those things to be taken into account, and the design guidelines for the fences recommended kind of go through that thought process of, we don't really recommend fences, but if you do have to have a fence, here's what we recommend that they look like to keep in style with the neighborhood.
Okay, I think that would be helpful.
Okay, so that's how it reads now. That's how it would work. Is it would go to the A or B for kind of mitigation, how high they recommend it, and it's hard when you don't have a proposal in front of you, right? So you can't say, oh, this would take it into account. You can see over. We have to have it for our 2 dogs or our kids, or that type of thing. So those are all taken into account when the A or B does review it. Any other comments on the fences? Okay, all right, thank you all for that. So the next thing, we're going to jump back to number 8, but the tax rates and insurance rates, and how that might affect the property if they're put into a historic overlay district. I reached out to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and they have an insurance services group that deals specifically with insurance for historic houses. And I asked them Barbara was kind enough to let us write an estimate on her house for Hollin Hills, just to get some numbers about what it would be. And what this company does with the National Trust is they kind of, I call them the general of insurance for historic houses, where they search different options for you and find the best one for your quote. So the quote that we got for Barbara's house came back with 3 different, it was Safeco, Penn National, and Travelers Insurance, and gave 3 different options based on what her house had. So that's the kind of, and without getting into too much information, that would be a comparison of kind of just a spot check of your current insurance rates versus if the historic overlay district was put on. That doesn't mean that the historic overlay district affects the property value. I talked to the National Trust person about that and asked them about the designation of the house, and they said they really don't necessarily take that into account, other than that's their specialty, is looking at historic houses and houses of significance. So from her perspective, it was, you can get traveler's insurance for a house that's not in a historic overlay district. So it didn't really necessarily affect the insurance rates if there was a designation for a historic overlay district on the property.
If I can comment, the insurance rate that they suggested was comparable to the rate that I'm now paying. So there essentially was no difference.
Okay, great. Thank you, Barbara. And then the second question, part of that was about tax rates. The county does not tax a property in historic overlay district any differently than it does outside of a historic overlay district. And that's consistent with all the 13 other historic overlay districts in the county right now.
Taxes, does they contemplate providing tax credits for for HODs or specific?
So there is, I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. There is not from the county. There are tax credits available, I think, from the state
Yes.
for rehabilitation through the Virginia Landmarks Register, because Hollin Hills is listed on the state. There's no, you can't get tax credits for the National Register because it has to be a commercial building. But the state does have options for tax credits for modifications to the property. And Barbara, it sounds like you know a little bit about it, and I know Jerry knows about it too, but the county does not offer tax rebate, sorry, for any modifications to the houses.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody in Hollin Hills has actually applied to VDHR for tax credits or not.
I don't think so either. I think I asked them that at one point a while ago. I don't know. How many years have we been working on this? 3 years now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I asked them at one point a while ago. But
And they are good for all kinds of things. I mean, it's like upgrading in, you know, HVAC. And I mean, if you have a big enough project, it covers a lot of stuff. So it does have to be a fairly large project, but I think it's maybe $50,000, which nowadays is not that large a project. So I could be wrong about the amount.
So
but-
that,
it's replacing your windows, right?
Right.
Basically. But yeah, so there are options for that. It's just the county doesn't offer them specifically. So that's all I had based on the community meeting questions. I know it's almost 8 o'clock, so I wanted to get through some of the contributing and non-contributing structure discussions. If I know we had some comments on that, but was there any other outstanding thing from the community meeting? Those questions. I'm going to go back and do some clarification on the fences part, just so we have it clear. I know Lily did a good job kind of laying that out, but want to make sure from tonight's conversation we have a clearer understanding of fences and kind of what came out from that conversation. And then also about the DRC process versus the A or B process. So, okay. Let's go on to next one. That's just a boundary if we need it. And then I'm going to go to the PowerPoint. Were there any structures that I have a PowerPoint put together of all, actually I did not put it together, Kira Davis put it together, but of all of our non-contributing structures or non-contributing properties, excuse me, in the historic overlay district. Were there any in particular? I know Mary Tracy had a couple that she wanted to discuss, and we kind of answered those questions and the comments to the best of our ability, but I'm happy if there's some that are specifically outstanding. I will say before we start though, that we don't necessarily have to reach an agreement, and we can agree to disagree on the contributing and non-contributing. What we will do is that in the staff report, we will note, for example, if we don't think X structure is contributing or X structure is non-contributing, we will note that. And then it's also an opportunity for the work group. I know we're doing 2 letters at this point, but if there's some that you feel strongly were contributing or non-contributing, that would be your opportunity to discuss that as well. So I'm not looking for consensus tonight, but for discussion of the items. So I know that was something that came up of which ones were non-contributing, and I think we have, oh, I did have that on the slide of, we had 37 non-contributing. Most of them are the new park areas, were the new ones. I think there were 10 or so. There were 14 other ones that we had changed since the National Register nomination. But did anybody have any that they specifically wanted to go through? Once again, we have 100 slides on my PowerPoint, and I really, just for the photo's sake. But Jerry, if you want to go ahead.
I had another question. So
Sure.
Since you're adding some additional non-contributing, do you have any sense of how that would impact the list that VDHR has and tax credits on those properties? Have you happened to talk to VDHR about what would happen just in case somebody actually wanted to apply for tax credits?
So you mean for the contributing and non-contributing properties?
For the, well, if they've switched, if they've gone from one to the other, how do you think, did you talk to VDHR about how they would handle that? Would it make a difference? Would they just say it was contributing, we're just going to count it as contributing, or?
So it goes to the analysis that was done. So because it's a local county historic overlay district, it's what's contributing to the county historic overlay district, not the National Register or the Virginia Landmarks Register, from my understanding.
They would not necessarily take it into account.
Correct.
Or
That's
they
my
might look at it and go, oh my God, you've added all these things and we don't even think you're contributing. So they could personally change their mind.
I think, and Millie, you probably know better than me, but I think Lee petitioned to have her house removed from the contributing structure. So I think that there is an opportunity for that conversation, as you're talking about, Jerry, to have at the state level. It's just for, and I know it makes it as clear as mud, but for the state and the national level, you're looking at what's on the National Register listing for contributing and non-contributing. For the county level, it's a different set of criteria. So it would be different for the tax purposes. But as from what I understand, the National Register listing is more inclusive than ours from the county perspective. So that's just a difference. But thank you for bringing that up, because it could come up. But I doubt that VDHR is going to just start dropping. You know, we're not. You know, they'd love to have that conversation with you regardless of that. So and to be honest, I don't necessarily. And you might know the difference, Jerry, but I'm not sure if the contributing or non-contributing status is the tax credits, because if it's on, you know, if it's within the historic overlay district, and that's what I'm saying, it's just such a
I don't know. I don't
trivial.
Yeah, Laura, I think this is Sarah. So for the tax credit purposes, and this is, I believe this applies to the residential as well, but it doesn't, you have to be a contributing resource, and you actually have to prepare an application that verifies its contributing status. So if a number of additions were made over the years, VDHR could come back and say, this is actually no longer contributing. So.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Sarah. See, and that's, but that's the conversation to have, because, you know, it's as we've talked about this whole time, it's subjective. So they could disagree with us that, you know, a property is contributing or non-contributing. But go ahead.
Okay. Now, I may not have the most recent list on it, but I noticed a number of the houses that weren't on the original thing were put on. But it's not entirely clear to me. You said staff had made those decisions, but I think we need to know exactly. I mean, my impression is for some of them that I don't think are a problem. You know, they apparently complained about narrow windows and things like that. And it appears some of the houses on Stafford Road, which I think are perfectly conforming, the ones that were labeled in terms of fitting into the landscape and things like that. And so I just wonder if one of the objections that people have is because a lot of the houses that seem to be called non-conforming are ones that, you know, don't have total openness to the road, but I think that is something that's important to people, you know, that they don't, I mean, you don't want people staring in your house. You don't want them driving by and lining you up and stuff like that. So I think it's more the idea that they fit into the landscape, but I think if we know exactly what caused those decisions will be very important to understand, because I would say some other ones, for instance, the one up on the top of Martha's Circle, which the house looks okay, it's got skinny windows, but the house across the street actually, I mean, the big addition is facing the road, but it looks like just an old regular house. It doesn't look particularly mid-century modern. So I think, to me, the most important thing is to fit into the landscape, not to disturb things. But I think we need to know exactly why some of these decisions were made, you know, be very specific about why they're considered non-conforming.
Yeah, Mary, thank you for reminding me of that. So when we went through, just to back up a little bit, when we went through, and Kira can vouch for me on this, we went through each property in the historic overlay district and kind of took 5 criteria that we looked at to see whether or not it kind of met the defining principles. And these are the 5. We looked at sculptural brick chimney and masonry end walls. And I understand not this list is not comprehensive of the entire neighborhood, but it has large wall expanses of glass windows. The roof designs have shallow pitched flat shed roof or V-shaped butterfly roof. There's a preservation of the natural landscape, and then it's architecture that's characteristic of the modern movement. So we kind of took that checklist for each of the structures, looking at it first from the street view, and then if it was questioned, we went back to you all and said, what do we think about this at the work group meetings in the summer of 2019? Then with that information, we went back and we said, we analyzed each one again and said, I don't know if does it meet any of these principles? Does it not? So we went through the checklist, and if it met 4 out of the 5, we said it was contributing. If it was on the fence, we put it as non-contributing. Once again, these are subjective, but that's the criteria that we use, the methodology that we used, looking at the architecture, the brick chimneys, the glass window expanses, the roof designs, and the landscaping. So that's the criteria we applied to each of the houses, looking at the additions and what came through. And then Mary, in the I think you had some specific ones that you had asked about, and I had put that justification in the comment response matrix from the questions, and I'm happy to go through those if we need to, but
the ones on Stafford were, I agree with Mary, the ones on Stafford really gave people a lot of agita, because it seems that those houses do have the chimneys, the windows, the roof design, but what they have, as Mary pointed out, is there's some kind of a privacy fence in the front that blocks the view of the house from the street. But beyond that privacy fence, the main house is still there.
Mhm.
And that seems to have been ignored in a number of these instances. I think that the issue on Stafford is especially seen. And also with a couple of houses, there's a 2-story house on Elba. You know, the whole house is still there. It's exactly the same. It just has a 2nd story, which exactly conforms to the 1st story.
So if we go to, can we just focus street by street? I'm sorry, I know you all know the neighborhood much better than I do, and I'm sorry, just trying to keep up on some of
Let's do Stafford, and so that would be 7303, 7308, 7310, and 7314.
Okay, so for this one, 7308, let me pull up our.
Yeah, I couldn't see what 7314, I couldn't see what any problems with that one were.
Can you all see my PowerPoint? I'm sorry.
As you just mentioned, 03 and 08 are right around me, and they're not privacy fences. Those are structural bumps in the front that block the entire house.
I don't think it's a problem. I think the idea is it fits in. I mean, I just don't see that as a problem. It's the same thing as these huge additions you know, that overwhelm other neighboring houses and stuff like that. I mean, there's some of those that have happened.
7308 though has this kind of hexagon addition in the front, as well as, I'm sorry, my mouse isn't working.
Laura, we can't see your screen if you have it up.
I'm sorry. That's what I was trying to ask. All right, let's see. Kira, I can't hear you. Kira, I can barely hear you if you're talking.
Sorry. I always forget to put this mic thing down.
Can you see, wait, can you all see that PowerPoint now? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is Stafford. So Stafford has this hexagon addition on the front, but then for this one, we kind of put it on the bubble and said we need more information on. So we went and looked, and there was some more. This is still on the front, sorry, but on the side there were some modifications as well. And we did some aerial research as well to look kind of the building footprint had changed and been modified. So this you can see it still has some of the windows here, but then we also took the criteria of that if more than one of the facades was modified drastically, that we determined it non-contributing, just because.
Where does that come from? Where does that rule come from?
That's staff's methodology. So when we looked at it as
anybody else, that's not the National Register methodology.
That's correct. That's a historic overlay district analysis that we came up with looking at the entire neighborhood.
Well,
so that's why there's a difference between what's contributing on the National Register versus what's contributing for the historic overlay district.
Well, I would say that, you know, you don't want to have a total Levittown in the thing. I think you know, if people put on additions that fit pretty much fit into the landscape and stuff like that, I don't think that I don't think that's necessarily non-contributing. And I think the same thing with the Kinsler house. You know, the back of it is still perfectly normal. Actually, where the trees are there, behind there, it's open on that side. That's their bedrooms there. I can understand why people don't want, you know, their bedrooms facing the street with huge windows.
Right. No, and agree. This is, as I said, the methodology was if it had been changed too drastically since the beginning, and taking that as a whole, not the beginning, but since its original construction, or had construction after the period of significance, that we felt that it was non-contributing. And once again, not trying to come to consensus or conclusion, but just the methodology that we looked at in the neighborhood overall of what structures kind of rose to that level of being non-conforming.
We also took their massing into consideration of the additions, how large they were in proportion to the dwelling and such. And if they were so large that they overwhelmed the original facades, then that's something that we also took into consideration.
Mm-hmm. Well, I see a difference between these and, for instance, the house across from Lee Cutler's, which is, you know, huge, very tall. I mean, it may look somewhat, but it is overwhelming there. I think that the house on the across the third house from the bottom on Stafford on the same side as Millie's, you know, that one is overwhelming too. And I mean, the people next door, you know, have a real problem because it blocks their views and stuff like that. I don't think this, I mean, I don't think that's a real problem here. And I would say even, you know, I have two immediate neighbors whose houses were labeled as non-conforming, and I would say they're maybe not totally, one is somewhat similar to the Kinsler's house, and you know, they blocked off a lot of the front, but the house inside is still very, very Hollin Hillsy and looks out on the park, but you know, it is a certain privacy thing. So these are just questions that I would raise. I mean, I'm much more concerned about things like the height. I'd like to see in the zoning a limitation on the height because I think that would make a big difference. You know, that way you could still see your chimneys and stuff like that. The house behind me, you know, which is non-conforming. I mean, that has got a huge, very tall addition. They even raised the chimney, but the chimney is dwarfed by the thing. I think it's probably close to 35 feet tall now, you know, from the street level, and that does overwhelm things. It overwhelms the neighbors. It just isn't, you know, the idea of fitting into the landscape as much. And I think to me, that's more important. But that's my opinion.
Can someone explain to me what the difference is? I know what the difference between contributing and non-contributing is, but there seems to be much to do about nothing, because even if you have, what happens if you have 3 non-contributing houses together? Are they any less subject to the HOD than if they were contributing? Or if you have 4, 2 across from each other? Does that make a difference? I don't see that it does, because everyone is lumped into the same thing and all affected. So I don't know what the big deal is, whether you're contributing or non-contributing, unless you want to get tax credits from Virginia, maybe. I've never seen the point.
There's a couple distinctions. So from the ARB standpoint, it's a little bit easier to get your demolition permit if the house is non-contributing, because that means it's been vetted and it doesn't have the factors that we feel, I mean, obviously up to the ARB's purview, of course, to make the decision, but it would allow for saying this is not significant to the historic overlay district. Another piece is that it has characteristics that we do not want repeated within the district. Like, we don't want another hexagonal addition to go in the front yard of a new house. So that's why they're kind of examples of not what not to do, but examples of things that wouldn't necessarily meet the general definition of what you would think of as a typical Hollin Hills house. Not to say we're trying to take away from the individuality of the houses, and that's how they've become significant over time, but just from the cohesiveness of the community. But you are correct in that they are all treated, in addition to a non-contributing structure, is treated as the same as an addition to a contributing structure.
Okay, so
or
the only,
ARB.
you've helped me on, I've heard this before. You can, if someone needed to tear down a non-contributing structure, it would be probably a lot easier route to go than if they were contributing. And also, you don't want people pointing to a funny looking, I'm going to say funny looking because that's a highly technical term, structure, and saying, I want to do just like that. And since you have that as contributing, that must be okay. You don't want that.
Correct.
Okay, I get it. Okay. But otherwise, they're pretty much the same. They don't,
Laura, could we see some more views of these houses?
what?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm just kind of leafing through. Sorry, I have, like I said, I have 100 slides and Kira put them together
no,
for me.
but
So there's just
It's very
But,
long.
but
so these
It's
are the
all of
ones
our
that-
survey photos that we took that helped us determine.
And also another thing I will say too is some of them we were not allowed access to the property, and that's perfectly fine. So we had to go on what information that we had, and sometimes it was just the street view. So that's another piece of information that, you know, we looked at aerials, we looked at other pieces, but these are just different. Oh, there's pictures of us, different elevations.
And just to clarify again, I heard you say something about Lee Cutler's house, and she did something because I saw that that was now labeled as a conforming house, but to me, it looks like a Cape Cod house. You know, I think that I find the hexagon thing far, you know,
less issue.
less of an issue than a very steep roof.
Before we go on to that, were there any other properties? And once again, if there's specific properties that you feel that you don't agree with us on, please put that in the letter for example, if you don't agree with me on the hexagon house, put it, you know, we disagree that this property is contributing or not contributing. And that's something, then it comes to we will note that, and it will be the Board of Supervisors making the final decision on whether they feel it's contributing or non-contributing. That's something that they won't go through each property, but if there's specific ones that we have a disagreement over, not disagreement, but don't necessarily agree on for whatever reason, they will go through and that will be brought up to their attention.
So I just had one more question.
Sure.
So when you talk about easier to get a demolition permit, but if they did that and they wanted to build something new or partially new, then they would probably have to do something even stricter to get through the ARB, I'm guessing.
That's correct. So not only would the demolition permit have to go through the ARB, but the new construction permit would have to go through the ARB as well.
Okay.
The new construction would also have to be in conformance with the design guidelines and be approved by the ARB, but that would be their reference to look like the Hollin Hills houses.
Okay. Bob, did you have?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that it was very helpful to see those views of those three houses on.
I'm gonna share. Like I said, I have 100 slide PowerPoint, but we're gonna post this on the website, or I can share it with the work group somewhere and share file, and you can look at all the pictures that we have that went into our decision making. Yeah. And then, so I know that Lee's house was going to come up, and unfortunately she's not here to talk to it herself tonight. But did want to go through our justification for that, because I know, hold on one second. I have, okay. So let me pull up I have one more, I think I have another PowerPoint. Sorry, I have so many documents on this. Oh, you know what? I think I put it at the end of the normal one. Sorry, let me share this again. Oh yeah, okay.
Laura, your screen is gray that you're sharing.
Okay, thank you. Share my screen, screen 2. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Okay. So that's Lee's house. That's 7305 Rebecca. And I went through and tried to do some more research on it, what we looked at for that house. So the National Register determination for this house was contributing, and the staff determination still remained contributing.
The roof was put on after the National Register.
Yeah.
Correct, right. And so we went through and kind of looked at that checklist that we had of what features that it had. So was the chimney still present? Yes, but it was an increased height with additional brick put on. But you could see where the additional brick was added. The windows on the side elevation that are prominent to the street still exist and remain. The roof obviously was a big change with pitch and height that was not uncharacteristic with the district. The landscape remained, I know there was a large tree on the property that came down, but the landscape remained generally the same. And it doesn't meet the modern roof aspects of the other houses. So kind of taking those into concern, looking at the elevations, and then we talked about, you know, our discussion about that came up before in our meetings about if the new addition looked different enough that you could know it's different, compatible but differentiated, I guess is what, I forgot exactly what the term is for the Secretary of Interior Standards, but something along those lines where you want it to look different, but it still meets the intent. So here, obviously, the roof changed, and I did pull up, I was able to find pictometry, and I'm sorry, I meant to do this earlier today. Pictometry from 2013, like as a before and after, to kind of see what the roof change really was. But please feel free, if we want to discuss it, to go ahead and I will pull that up. But that was our justification, is the chimney remains in the same place. The windows, the large row windows that are characteristic to Hollin Hills remains in place. The door, the original kind of front facade other than the roof remains in place. And it would be, you can tell that the roof shape has changed from the original construction of the house.
I think that the objection that people have raised comes from the fact that, yes, we recognize that the windows and the chimney and the landscape remain the same. But the consequence of raising the roof is to change the innate character of the house. It no longer it no longer sits low to the land, but rather sits like, you know, a wedding cake topper. And as someone said earlier, looks more now like a Cape Cod with odd, you know, with strange windows. This does, we're in other places in Hollin Hills, you found that an addition overwhelmed the house. And I guess what a lot of people on the working committee have expressed is that the feeling that this roof overwhelms the whole of the house and sort of cancels out the roofs, the fact that the chimney and the windows and the landscaping remain the same and the front doors in the same place. It's the character, it's the overwhelming nature of the roof. That I think is summarizes essentially what a lot of the dispute with respect to this house has comes from.
I just don't think it looks particularly mid-century modern. I think he could have done, you know, the architect could have done a better job making
There was
it.
no architect.
Well, somebody designed it.
Let me share one more. I did pull up, I found the aerials. My apologies, I keep changing screens here. I did find pictometry from 2019 versus 2013. So you can see, let me pull it up. Let me stop sharing my screen. Did I stop? I'm gonna share it now. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, it's very small, so you might have to kind of, I don't know if I can make it too much bigger. But so this is just a screen grab from our pictometry of the image on the above is 2019 today, and then the image below is 2013 before the roof was raised. And so from staff's perspective, you can see the roof change, but you can also see the elements that still remain the same that make it significantly Hollin Hills. So I just, you know, once again, we don't have to agree, but wanted to kind of use this as an opportunity that if we still had some that we did not agree on, to kind of call those out, and so that we would be able to highlight those both in the staff report and that make those aware, and so that would help you all with your letters about what you do and do not support the staff report. So with that, I don't have anything. Oh, I do want to go over the next steps. It is 8:23.
Laura, can you hear me? This is Mike McGill. I wanted to add something.
Yes, Mr. McGill, go ahead.
My problem with this is that the steeply pitched roof is the antithesis of the modern style of architecture. The whole philosophy of modern architecture is form follows function. And it also emphasizes the importance of focusing on the basic purpose or function of the house. The roof is simply the lid on the box. And the roof has no separate character or function beyond that. The trouble with a big steep roof like this is that it draws attention from the box, which is the whole point of form follows function. It says, pay attention to the roof instead. That's why Barbara, for instance, said it overwhelms the overall appearance of the house. There's no reason for this roof.
Okay, thank you. Were there any other comments on 7305, Rebecca?
Well, at the time, I mean, I'm not sure. I wasn't in favor of a lawsuit against it, but I would say one thing that would help a lot is, you know, more plantings of trees, you know, to make it less observable for everyone, because it's most Hollin Hills properties aren't totally bare like that with big fences behind them.
Thank you, Mary, for bringing that up. That's a good point of some of the good example of some mitigation that the ARB would ask for and request with new construction and new additions. So that's something that if this had come before the ARB would have been taken into account.
Well, I do think that, I mean, I don't think everything has to be exactly like
Right.
The original, but I think it's very important to keep the mid-century modern feeling of, you know, low sloping roofs, flat roofs, things like that. And, you know, this just doesn't look like a mid-century modern house anymore to me. You know, I mean, when you drive past it, what you see is a Cape Cod colonial, Cape Cod.
Thank you, Mary. All right, so we've got about 5 more minutes left. Want to go over the next steps real quick, moving forward. So as Nick and I talked about earlier, And this is just a very general timeline. You know, our first thing that we're going to do after this is talk about the survey, what that looks like, when that's going to go out. The work group meeting is tonight. We're still shooting for the Board of Supervisors, the zoning ordinance authorization amendment to go before the board in July of 2021. So what that means, and Lily, feel free to jump in on when we have to publish our staff report, because I think it's 6 weeks. Is it 6 weeks out or 4 weeks out from the authorization hearing?
Right, about 6 weeks before the authorization.
Okay, so that would put us mid May for the publication. If we're looking early July, so it'd probably be. So I don't have my July. It'd probably be mid to late July for the authorization. And that looking 6 weeks out, they're looking either at the beginning or mid-May or early June for the publication. So what publication means, as I was talking about at the beginning of the meeting, is that it's published to the public. So that's all of staff comments taken into account, all our analysis done, all the pieces put together, vetted through all of our managers, supervisors, etc., and then published to the public for comment. There was a question about whether or not the work group input and letters would be included in that staff report, and I'm thinking yes, but I'm going to check with our county attorneys to make sure that's okay.
What letters are you referring to there?
This is the work group, the letters from the work group in support or opposition.
So you're looking for the work group to write you 1 letter, 5 letters, individual letters?
There was a discussion about if the work group didn't agree and there being a minority and majority kind of opinion for the historical overlay district. And so from my understanding there was going to be 2 separate letters written from the work group opinions about the historical overlay district. Is that incorrect? That was my understanding from the discussions from the work group that we'd had before.
I think that there was some discussion about the whole notion of one big comment from one viewpoint and one from the other, but I think that it evolved to basically, I thought it said that anyone who wanted to comment on the staff report and have a comment included as an attachment, not part of, but as an attachment, could do so. Because not necessarily everyone might have a slightly different comment in favor or a slightly different comment in opposed, and a different emphasis. So I think it should be open to the working group to decide how they want to do it, individually or collectively.
When would you want to see those letters by, Laura?
Well, and that's what I'm thinking now, is that if we want individual letters from people in the work group, then that would not be able to be included. So the goal was for the work group was to get a consensus from the work group, however that might be, even if it's, support, or split of the issues that came up in that process. But if we're doing specific comments from each work group member, that really needs to go after the staff report and be included for public comment for example, the Board of Supervisors to take into account.
Well, I don't think that we'll do a letter for each individual, but probably 2. One from 2 different letters, and then they could be included, right?
I'm going to check. I'm thinking yes, but let me verify, because my understanding was that we would say attachment 2 is please see attachment 1 and attachment 2 for comments from the work or something like that. This is the work group process that we went through. We had 12 meetings, 13 meetings, whatever. And this is the discussions that we had. And then for additional comments from the work group, see attachment 1 or 2.
Will we have another work group meeting when we see the final version of the staff report?
Not until after it's published. So the work group will not get to review the draft. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I mean, I just want, but before they have the Board of Zoning meeting, will the work group have a chance to sit down and see if we have any, general views, or if we want to split the views, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because we haven't seen what's actually going to be there.
So you've seen the findings, you just haven't seen the analysis of the staff report. So you've seen the boundary, the contributing, the non-contributing, the zoning ordinance amendment draft. That's all that's the decisions that are coming out of it. But we can definitely have another meeting if we need to work together on what those letters were going to be and or say, or we can appoint the co-chairs to work on those letters.
Well, I just think it would be a good idea for us to see the final version, just to say, I mean, because some questions were raised tonight, for example, and I'm not sure everybody agrees, with some of the conclusions there. But I just think before the Board of, before it goes to the Board of Zoning, or to the Board of Supervisors, that this work group ought to, see the final version, have a chance to talk about it, see what we want to do about it as a group, and we can certainly do it as individuals. I just think it would make sense to at least have one more meeting on that.
Okay, so if our staff report is due mid-May, I'm assuming we wouldn't want to have any later than beginning of May for those letters. So if we have 2 letters, beginning of May, then we could have another work group meeting sometime in April, or just send them through email. It's up to you all how we want to coordinate.
So you said that the report won't be ready till May, is that correct?
Yeah, but we have to publish it and vet it before we can do that. So we would need your letters ahead of time to be able to review them and attach them to the document.
Laura,
Would we see the document before it gets published then, so we
No.
can comment on it?
No, because
Okay.
you can't see the draft before it's published.
Why?
But you can see the analysis, because that's not how we're showing you the findings that we have, and all the findings of the zoning ordinance, the boundaries, the significance, and all the things that we've talked about. But we don't let the community see the draft before we publish. It's not standard practice for the county.
So if we made a comment, our comment would be, this is what we did, this is what we know thus far, and this is what we support or don't support.
Right. And then after the staff report is published, and so there's like a chicken and the egg, right? So if you want it included in the staff report, you're commenting on what you have so far. But if you want to comment on it afterwards, then you'd have to wait till it's published in order to do that. So it could go.
And presumably appear perhaps at the supervisors meeting?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's an opportunity that, and it might make more sense to wait until after it's published to have the work group comments, but they'll be included as public comment, but they're not going to be included with the distribution of the staff report, if that makes sense. So they won't be included as attachments, but they'll be included as part of the public comment and taken into account for the decision-making process.
But if they were submitted before your staff report, then they could be included in the staff report.
Yeah.
Well, yes or no? I mean, if the staff didn't agree with the comments, would they include them?
Yeah, because we worked with the work group, and that was what so in our kind of work group discussion, we would say that this is how the work group talked about, this is what we discussed, and then these are the outstanding issues that we had, see attachment 1. And then it would be the letters from the work group.
So if we want to have any input, really, we need to get it in before your staff report comes out.
You can comment after the staff report. I mean,
would it mean anything? Is my question.
What if you commented after?
Yes.
Yeah, it goes as part of the public record, and the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors review the information before and take that into account before not before the board authorization, not the one in July, but the one in the fall, when it goes to the final decision about if they're going to adopt the historical overlay district or not.
basically, if we want any comments to be attached to the staff report, we have to do it kind of flying blind, not with the benefit of the analysis. And the staff report, the analysis is what's important. So we wouldn't be able to comment on your analysis, just what you've done, basically, as opposed to commenting after the fact.
Right.
So we could influence the staff report somewhat with our letters if we got them in earlier. But
No.
It won't have any effect on the staff report.
Unfortunately not, because if we have a different conclusion than what you have, that's not necessarily means we're going to change our mind from what our discussion is. It's just a matter.
I didn't mean it would necessarily, but could it influence it? That's really the question. In other words, are we wasting our time or are we not?
If you include it in the staff report or after the staff report, it's all part of the public record.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you want to have a cohesive example or a cohesive and like a response to it, my recommendation would be to wait till the staff report's published, and then you would be able to see all of the analysis to it. But if you want it included with the distribution of the report, then you'd have to comment kind of on what you have now.
Well, can you comment both times?
Yes.
Okay.
For sure. It's just that the comment from the work group is going to be without the benefit of seeing the entire staff report. But what you're going to see from the staff report isn't all the findings have come out to be what we've talked to you about tonight. So there shouldn't be any surprise, or not tonight, but throughout the whole process, there shouldn't be anything surprising in the staff report saying it's not significant, or, and for example, why we're talking about fences ad nauseum tonight, to make sure we have all of that understood before we move forward.
It's fair to say, though, that you will make a recommendation, quite, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Okay, were there any other comments? I know we're over time, but I'm happy to, if we have any other comments, I'm happy to stay and chat.
No, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody very much. I am still working on some of those items that we talked about. We'll clarify some of the questions, but please feel free if you have any comments or questions, you know where I am, and feel free to call me as well. All right. Thank you everybody, and have a good rest of the night.
Thank you,
Laura.
Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, so we turn out here. Yes, leave event. Leave event.
Mary, I'm proud of you. You got on. How do I stop sharing? That's what I want to do. Okay, can we go to, I'm going to stop recording.